Oh, we can't hear you. Oh, I think you're muted at the moment on your end.
I think I'm good now.
Oh, you're good now. Yay. Okay. Now, Kinjarling, Albany, Western Australia, we're still getting our head around the tech down south, down here. But thank you so much for joining us. Now, you can see me here in this lovely little space. You're on a gorgeous big screen, and we've got a room absolutely full of people.
Oh, hello, everybody. I can't see you, but I feel the love.
The way that we have it set up is that I'm looking at you on the screen. So unfortunately, I won't be making eye contact. I hope that's not too awkward.
No, that's fine.
I reckon you're probably old hat at these now, though, right? All the Zoom stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
I did a lot during COVID. So
yeah, I imagine so. All right. Now, just before I start, I will just acknowledge that we're here tonight on Menang Buja. Thank you so much for everyone coming tonight. We're gathered here on Menang Buja. It's so important to acknowledge that this is the space that we're in. It's thanks to the caretaking that they have had for generations that we live in such a biodiverse hotspot. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight, and it's wonderful to have you with us. Now, what country are you coming from in the Adelaide Hills?
I'm on Paramount country.
Paramount.
I live on Paramount country in the Adelaide Hills, but I also work in Adelaide Plains, which is Ghana country.
Ah,
so,
and what's that country like?
Paramount country is beautiful. It's wine country, so it's a lot like Margaret River.
Okay,
yeah, but it's undulating. It's very cold and wet right now, but very hot in summer. It's beautiful country, and I have five acres. Here.
I saw that on your website actually. So that must be a beautiful writing space for you there.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But my partner built me a beautiful writing room as well. It's everything you would ever want, and I can't write a single creative word in there. So I take myself off to the local coffee shop, and that's where I write my books.
I'm just going to ask the audience, how can you hear Pip all right? Yep, that's great. And you can hear me. I project pretty damn well. So, all right. So Pip.
Yeah.
Firstly, thank you so much for writing the Bookbinder of Jericho. It's beautiful.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Yeah.
I did it just for you. So
you're
very welcome.
So tell us a bit about young Pip. What were you like as a kid, and what was your relationship to reading?
Yeah, good question. So as a child, I was very shy and quiet, not dissimilar, perhaps, to Esme in Dictionary of Lost Words. I read a lot, but actually I had I suppose a strange relationship to reading and words because I have dyslexia. So reading probably took me a little longer to learn how to read, but once I learned how to read, it was hard to get a book out of my hands.
Yeah.
Though I read very slowly. So I read slowly as a child, and I still read very slowly, which is sometimes a, occupational hazard. Particularly when I was an academic, it was an occupational hazard. But, like most kids with learning differences, you develop workarounds, and that's what I did. But it never stopped me from loving the power of words and story, and it didn't stop me from writing either. So yeah.
What kinds of books did you enjoy as a child?
So I wasn't a precocious reader. I read age-appropriate books.
Yep.
But the books that I think I remember the most that stick in my memory were the Trixie Belden books. I don't know if there's anybody in the audience.
Did anybody read the Trixie Belden books? Yeah, okay. Yeah, quite a few hands went up.
Yeah, so if I had to choose between all of those kind of series of child detective books, Trixie Belden would be my number one. And I think it's because she wasn't extraordinary. She wasn't the prettiest girl. She wasn't the smartest girl. but she was still the leader of a group of boys and girls, which I think was really important. And they solved mysteries, and I absolutely loved it. And I loved that someone like Trixie, who was hopeless at maths, could kind of solve the mysteries, and that's what I really loved about those books.
So what about now as an adult? What kind of genre do you like?
I read everything. I love literary fiction. I do enjoy reading literary fiction, though there's a lot of literary fiction that, I often feel I should read, and I start reading and then I put it down because I'm just not as engaged as I'd like to be. But there's a lot of literary fiction that I just adore for all sorts of reasons. So often because of the story, often because of the writing or the mood. It could be anything. I really enjoy speculative fiction as well.
Oh, yeah.
And I actually think there's I do read historical fiction, but I don't go to the historical section of a bookshop. So I read historical fiction that is about a topic I'm interested in, or I read historical fiction from particular authors like Geraldine Brooks or Sebastian Barry, authors I love. But I don't necessarily go to historical fiction as a genre, if that makes sense. But the thing I've thought about this, I think speculative fiction and historical fiction have quite a lot in common, actually, because you have to imagine yourself into a world that you don't live in. And if you go in either direction, I think it's a similar leap of imagination. And perhaps that's why I enjoy both of those things.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting connection between those two genres. I've not thought of that before, but I think you're right. Yeah. So did you always want to be a writer?
Yes. I always wanted to write, which is a different question, isn't it?
Yeah.
So when I was little, writing just happened to be, ironically, the way I wanted to express myself. And I didn't write for other people other than my parents. Birthday cards were always a poetic project. But other than that, I just wrote for myself, including poetry and the beginnings of stories and journal writing. It was just very private. So I never thought of it as something that I might do for a sort of unknown audience, if that makes sense. But when I was 15, I published one of my poems in Dolly magazine. And I was quite lucky because it was the first time I'd thought of actually sending something out. And I was lucky enough to have it published straight away. So it was the very first thing I'd ever sent out, and it got published. That was
Dolly. Really... Read Dolly. Yeah, so many of us read Dolly.
Yeah. I mean, for my generation, and probably, it only folded about 10 years ago, not even that. So it's been in so many of our lives, and it was the most important magazine when I was a teenager. So that was really thrilling to have something I'd written published in a magazine. And yet I didn't actually try to publish anything else after that. And I didn't actually write anything creatively for publication for another 30 years. But that whole time I still wrote for myself, and I started to harbor, I guess, a desire to write for other people. I was working, I was studying, then I was working, then I was raising children, and all of those things that get in the way of your dreams. And so it took a long time to come back to it.
So as you've just kind of alluded to, your background prior to publishing, so the Dictionary of Lost Words that came out in 2020 was your first fiction work, but prior
Yes.
to that, you'd actually published it. You'd kind of co-written a book, and you'd published another book and they were non-fiction works. And then prior to that, your history was in academia. So can you tell us a little bit about that? And then if you could share with us, like, what brought you to writing the dictionary?
Yes, of course. So while I didn't publish anything creatively for another 30 years, I actually did publish quite a lot as an academic. So my background is in public health, psychology and sociology. So I worked as a social scientist and a lecturer at university. And I published quite a lot of research papers over the years in various fields, but mostly in health and psychology and sociology. And I wrote chapters of books, and I co-authored an academic, they call it a crossover book. It's the sort of thing that academics might read, but also a lay audience might read. It was called Time Bomb, Work Rest Play in Australia Today. So it was all about work-life integration, which was something that I was doing research on. And all of that writing experience was actually really important, I think, but mostly important in terms of the practice of writing. I was an academic. I didn't have a choice about, how long I could take to write something. I didn't have a choice about waiting for the muse to turn up. I just had to do the work. And I think that I suppose still serves me today. But academic writing is extremely different to creative writing. And so when I left academia, kind of, classic burnout and a desire to do something completely different, my family and I actually decided to leave our jobs. We pulled the kids out of school and we went to Italy and worked as willing workers on organic farms for about 6 months. And that experience was kind of this wonderful circuit breaker between, I guess, my academic self and the self I wanted to become. Writing about that journey was really invaluable to becoming a writer. It was invaluable because it was like an apprenticeship, really, for creative writing, because I still had to tell an engaging story, even though that story happened to be true. I had to use all of the craft of a fiction writer. And so for me, it was a wonderful learning experience, and it gave me the confidence especially when it got published, I then had the confidence to try fiction, which is what I'd always wanted to do. And I actually started writing a different book. I didn't start with the dictionary. I started with something more contemporary and based in Australia. But the idea for the Dictionary of Lost Words came to me after reading Simon Winchester's Surgeon of Crowthorne, and I understood how words were defined, and I understood that it was a gendered project. And the idea just bugged me. It just wouldn't let me go. And eventually I had to put the other project aside and start writing the Dictionary of Lost Words. I had, in some ways, no choice because it just kept intruding on all the other ideas that I had. And so I gave it a go. But I was not at all confident that I would be able to do that idea justice. And so I kind of kept it a secret. Just in case it was complete shit.
So how long did it take you to write the Dictionary of Lost Words?
Probably from beginning, like from the very first words I wrote to it being on the shelf was about 3 years. Which I have always thought was quite quick. But I know some people churn out a book a year. I just don't know how you can do that. But for me, I feel like that was a good pace. I was working as well, part-time. And there was a lot of research involved. I travelled to Oxford a few times, which was just a treat. But the writing itself was always, I enjoyed it immensely. I really loved writing that book and the Bookbinder, actually. They both had a very similar kind of experience for me, which was very positive. So I'm hoping that will always be the case, but I might just be spoilt.
So when did you know that you were going to write about Peggy and Maud and the Bindery girls? At what point did they come to you?
Actually, they came to me when I was doing my last research trip in Oxford for the Dictionary of Lost Words. So I was in Oxford in October 2019. It was actually, and actually it was a research trip that I'd brought forward because I had planned to go in April 2020.
Wow.
Everything was on my side, really, because the publisher was basically wanting to publish the book a little bit earlier. And I found that I had actually finished the draft and all I needed to do was fill in some research gaps.
Yeah.
And so I brought that research trip forward, thank goodness. And so I was in the archives at Oxford University Press, and I was writing a scene in the Dictionary of Lost Words that was about the binding of a book. There'll be no spoilers in this. I don't know who's read the books and who hasn't, but there's a book that gets bound in the Dictionary of Lost Words, and I wanted to know a little bit more about the women who might have helped to bind that book. And so I asked the archivist if he had any materials at all about the women who worked in the bindery during that time. And he brought me everything he had, which essentially consisted of a few photographs, black and white photographs of women folding the pages that come off the printers.
Yeah.
He introduced me to a really beautiful black and white film, silent film.
Oh, wow.
Which is about the making of a book at Oxford University Press. And I think it's the very first film footage that documents how a book is made in history. And it was made in the early 1920s. So it was only about, 5 years on from the time that I was interested in.
Yeah,
so it's pretty contemporary to my characters.
Yeah.
And it was wonderful. It showed me everything from the casting of the type that's used in the typesetting process, through to the books being packed onto lorries and taken around to the bookshop.
Wow.
But part of it was, again, the women folding. And then there was this really beautiful section of the film of a woman walking along a gathering bench where all of the sections of a book have been piled up, and she's gathering them onto her arms. And I watched this and was immediately taken by her grace, by, the dance that she seemed to be doing.
Yeah, because you referred to it as a dance. Yeah.
Yeah, and it really looks that way. She's so graceful in how she does this. She's so experienced. She's done this 1,000 times. The first thing I thought, though, was, I wonder what book she's gathering in her arms. I think I replayed it, over and over to see if I could get any hint.
You can spot anything,
which I couldn't. And then my second thought was, I wonder if she ever stops to read the words that she's just gathered onto her arms. And as soon as I thought that, I had a character. I had a woman who works in a bindery, is gathering all of the sections of a book, and she does stop to read. And then I knew exactly what would happen. Someone would come over, a supervisor would come over and reprimand her and tell her that her job is not to read the books, but to gather them, to bind them. And so I kind of then imagined this woman and what her life might have been like and what she might have aspired to. And it was all just there around me. I was in Oxford. I was at Oxford University Press. And as I walk out of the front gate, the thing I see across the road is Somerville College, which was the ladies' college of Oxford University. And so I suddenly have not just a character in my head, but I also know what she dreams of.
A dream,
She dreams of being a student at Somerville College, which is something that is almost impossible for her.
Gosh. So the Dictionary of Lost Words, we mentioned, came out in 2020. And the Bookbinder of Jericho was published March this year. So looking at these two release dates, these books were written at times of great social contrast. You know, for the Dictionary of Lost Words, the world was kind of grasping with the impacts of COVID. And then when this one came out, it's like the world were, learning to live with the effects. So I just wonder, like, what were the respective writing processes like, and how was that an impact for you?
Yeah, well, as I was writing the Dictionary of Lost Words, we had no idea what was coming.
Yeah.
So, my writing process was, I suppose, untouched by, that incredible social upheaval, despite the fact I was writing about a lot of social upheaval, the women's suffrage movement and the beginning of World War I. But as I was writing the Bookbinder, I started writing it before Dictionary was even published, because there's a period of time, about 6 weeks, where, you hand in the manuscript and it goes to the printers and there's nothing more you can do. Yeah. But it's not on the shelf yet. And so there's this lovely period of waiting. And that's when I started writing the Bookbinder of Jericho.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, of course, COVID happened. My book came out literally 2 days after we went into lockdown. So every single thing, or 2 days, 2 days after lockdown, everything that we had planned was cancelled, which was disappointing, of course, but worse things were happening for people around the world. So I have to be completely honest, it almost didn't bother me. It was really hard to get too upset about all of these things being cancelled when the news was just full of tragedy, real human tragedy.
Yeah.
And for me also, there was an upside. I didn't have to travel, which meant that I could stay and write
yeah.
And I now know what it means to travel with a book, because I've been doing it pretty much since February this year, and I haven't had more than 3 weeks at home at a time, and I haven't been able to write anything. So, I now realize, in a way, how wonderful it was for me to be able to sit and write the next story.
Yeah,
And it was a solace. I did have to, I told you earlier that I can only write in cafes, so I did have to figure out a way to write, because I still couldn't write at home. But in South Australia, we were allowed to park outside cafes, and so I would go park outside my cafe and sort of phone in the order, and they'd bring it to the window of the car, and I'd sit there for 3 hours a day.
Wow.
I found a way.
So your beautiful writing room that your husband created for you, what does that get used for, if not for writing?
It's excellent for napping, and it's good for reading. So I will often do research reading in there.
Yeah, okay. Yep.
And it's a great spare room. So
yeah.
But yes, I feel a little guilty that I don't use it more.
But I think that's really an interesting thing. Like, it's a room for other people's words, perhaps. And, Let's
say that. I might borrow that. That's an excellent way to refer to it.
Yeah. So did COVID impact any of your research and groundwork for either of the books?
Not for Dictionary, but definitely for Bookbinder.
Definitely for this one? Yeah, I wondered about that.
Because I was actually planning on going and living in the UK in 2021 to do more research for this book, which obviously I had to cancel that. But I had actually done quite a lot of research while I'd been there for Dictionary. So some of the research I could share between the books. I had, at least, because I'd had the idea when I was in Oxford, I did gather some materials for this book before coming home. I also had an excellent relationship with the archivist at Oxford University Press, and so I could email him with questions, and he would just go and look for the materials. And
that's awesome.
With answers. The other thing that happened, though, which was just, really interesting, as I was writing the Bookbinder of Jericho, I was writing about Germany invading Belgium and Belgian refugees arriving in Oxford, which is what happened in September 1914. Russia invaded Ukraine, and all over the news we have Ukrainian refugees fleeing to Europe and being welcomed with open arms. You know, it's an incredibly similar situation. And then, of course, I was writing about the Spanish flu, because the Bookbinder of Jericho is basically spans the years of the war, which includes the beginning of the Spanish flu. Yeah. And as I'm writing scenes around the Spanish flu, we're all going through, you know, a pandemic that's not so dissimilar. And the health response was also quite similar if you take vaccines out of the mix. You know, it's about social distancing and masks. And then the other thing is, this book is all about knowledge, who gets to make it, who gets to access it, and what happens when knowledge is denied because of your gender, because of your class.
Yeah.
And, you know, while I was writing these sorts of things, the Taliban take over Afghanistan, and they refuse to let women and girls attend university.
Yeah.
You know, so many people talk about history repeating. It doesn't really repeat, but it does echo. It's constantly, being revisited. And I found that as I was writing the book, which in many ways makes, it's one of the things I really love about historical fiction myself. I love reading historical fiction that makes me think about my own time and the issues that are present in my own time and context, because it often gives me a sort of deeper understanding or more perspective or a different angle to think about those things. And I just found it so resonant when I was writing this story, so resonant with things that were going on in the world today, which I think made it easier to write, actually. Because human emotions don't change. You know, while our clothes may change, our political systems may change, whether we can vote or not changes, but actually emotion doesn't. The way we love, the way we fear, anger, resentment, all of these things are the same through millennia. And so if that's what you're writing about, as long as you get the context right, it will resonate across the 100 years that mine had to reach for.
I found it really interesting when you entered into the territory of censorship with the letters. I really loved that you included letters, you know, feeding in these characters who are away at war. The censorship thing was really interesting, and how they found ways to try to get around the censorship and using the different postal service. And you can understand reasons why censorship had been needed. But I loved that you entered into having the conversation about how that impacted, you know, there's the war effort need for censorship, but then there's the social impact of that censorship when people writing these letters, trying to communicate the trauma they're feeling and receiving letters back from their loved ones, and not actually, their words hadn't landed, or their pain hadn't reached or registered. And I found that really interesting. What did anybody else think of that? I just thought it was really interesting. And that's not really a question, sorry, but just a bit of a statement. But I really liked that part. We've got a question down the back here, and I'm going to turn on this fancy little second mic. Do you reckon you could pass that back? Thank you so much.
Where am I going to?
There we go. Thank you so much, Sister Catherine.
Hi, Pip.
Can you hear her, Pippa?
I can, yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
It works, sorry. People.
Sorry, just in regards to the censorship and Tilda's letters home and how she got around that, I really want you to write a whole book on Tilda. Because
I know she's such a favourite, isn't she?
Yeah, she's a whole novel in herself.
I love Tilda.
yeah, ditto. Yeah, no, it's just the way you wrote her. It was like, you know, she was your best friend or your, you know, that auntie that everyone wants, literally.
Yeah, she's Bolshy.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed writing Tilda in both books, because she obviously walks in the pages of both of the books. But I didn't want to write a book about Tilda, because so many books are written about women like Tilda, you know, women who are extraordinary really for their time. They're confident, they're, you know, the suffragettes, they're the women who sort of step outside the norms that have been dictated to them for their gender and so on. And there are so many books and movies about women like that. And I did want to focus on women who are a bit more ordinary, actually, but I couldn't not have a Tilda in the background. So I really enjoy writing her in both books. And what I really loved about having her in the Bookbinder of Jericho was that I could actually explore her in more depth. So in the first book, you know, she is that, all those things I just described. She's that actress come suffragette. She's confident. She's sexually liberated, all of those things. But I actually wanted to see her, you know, in a context where she was challenged, and where the circumstances, I suppose, made her frailer. And of course, World War I was a time of enormous upheaval and tragedy and challenge for so many people, including many women who volunteered to be nurses in France and to work close to the front. And so that's why I put Tilda there. I wanted to see what it would do to her. And the other reason I put her there is, as you were talking about letters, in both books, letters are really important. If this was written now, there would be text messages and emails, because that's the common way to communicate. But back then, letter writing was so common that they in fact had 4 or 5 letter deliveries a day. That's how common letter writing was as a form of communication. So it makes perfect, you know, a lot of sense to include letters in a historical fiction like this, because it's been so present in people's lives. But for a novelist, particularly for a novel that's written from the first person perspective, I wanted the reader to have an understanding of the wider context, a bit of an understanding of what was going on in the war. And to do that, I had to introduce something other than Peggy's perspective, because Peggy didn't go to France. So I can't write about anything she doesn't see or feel or hear unless I introduce letters. And so in both books, I use letters as a device, in a way, to give the reader more context and another perspective. Yeah.
So I'm just going to ask you a little bit of a fun question here. In the article, 13 Australian authors share their creative rituals, that was featured on the Australian Writers Centre website, and it states that Melissa Lukashenko, who wrote Too Much Lip, plays a lot of online Scrabble as a warm-up before writing. And then it also said that Australian First Nations poet Alison Whittaker, who wrote Blackwork, absolutely has to have a cup of peppermint tea and a banana before she begins to write.
What a combination.
Right? No. Do you have any rituals, apart from potentially being in your car near a cafe? Do you have any other rituals or things that you do to get you into the zone?
Not really. I do Wordle every day, which I love, but it's not.
Oh, that got a big response.
Yeah, it's not a writing ritual. It's just a life ritual now.
Yeah.
I love Wordle. I suppose my ritual is that I get up and I get out of the house as if I'm going to work, and I go to one of my local coffee shops, and there is a ritual in that. And I actually trained myself to write in many ways in a cafe, because when I wrote my memoir, One Italian Summer, I did write that in my writing room, actually. And this is how I know I can't really write in my writing room, because I spent so much time procrastinating. It would always take me a long time to sit down.
Yeah.
I
feel you. I feel you, Pip.
And at the end of most days, I was really disappointed with what I'd achieved, because I'd either not done anything or I'd started so late that, and I had to go and pick the kids up, and I had 15 minutes in the end and whatever. But most days I just was disappointed, and that's actually not very good for your mental health. So when I started writing dictionary, I decided I just needed to write differently, because I wanted to enjoy it. And I decided just to associate writing with the thing I love most, which is coffee. And like I think I've already said, I have a background in psychology. So I just did classic Pavlovian conditioning on myself.
Yeah.
The coffee shop. I ordered a coffee. I opened my laptop, and I wasn't allowed to have a sip of coffee until I'd written one word.
Ooh.
And it took 3 days for me to develop this really enjoyable habit, because now when I think of writing, and I'm not kidding, I salivate because I know I'm going to get a coffee. So it was a really wonderful pairing. The other thing I did was I lowered my expectations. So a lot of writers have word goals. And I used to have word goals, which I failed.
I heard about this. Please continue on. I heard about this. I loved it. Keep going. My
word goal would start at 1,500 words, and I never wrote 1,500 words. And so, of course, I failed in that, that day I would fail and feel bad about myself. So I lowered it to 1,000, then to 750, then to 300 words, which is Virginia Woolf's goal. And you would think that 300 words would be possible. It's half a page or something.
Yeah.
And even then, I would often fail to reach 300 words. So I just decided that I would lower my expectations as low as I possibly could go. And I quite seriously have a word goal of 1. And I just have to write 1 word every day. And the only times I don't write is when I'm on the road. Otherwise, I write every day. And if I write 10 words, I'm an overachiever. And that's good. I have some friends who went to the Margaret River Writers Festival, and they said that you mentioned that there, and they came back and were like, you will not believe Pip Williams' word count. This is her goal. This is amazing. And I think you actually really motivated some people with that. Well, the thing is, if you think about it with any other habit that you want to start up in your life, like, say, walking, the hardest part is always getting started. It's not the walking. Walking's not hard, and writing's not hard.
Yeah.
The hard thing is sitting down and opening your laptop and getting the first couple of words down.
Yeah.
Just like the hardest part of walking is putting your running shoes on and getting to the top of the driveway. Once you're at the top of the driveway, there's no way you will turn back unless it starts to hail.
Yeah.
You'll walk up the road, and you might just walk up the road. You might not go around the block even, but you've still done a few steps more than you would have if you put your shoes on and walked out the door. But sometimes once you get started, it's hard to stop. And sometimes I write 300 words. Sometimes I write 1,000. Sometimes I only write 10. But it's okay, because, 10 is better than none. And so I walk away from that writing session feeling good about myself, which is actually very conducive to doing it again.
I love that, Pip, because in this kind of social media driven, kind of saturated world that we have, where there's all this instant gratification and everyone seems to be doing amazingly, that's such really good self-care. It's really kind expectations for yourself. I'm going to take that on board. I like that.
Yeah. It helps to not be on social media.
Well, yeah. There's that too. I could just put my phone down. So I'll just quickly, before I move on to some other questions, when we were talking about the dictionary and Bookbinder, kind of it occurred to me, like, you could have just written two separate stories. You didn't have to intertwine them, and I'm ever so glad you did. But I'm interested to know what made you decide to intertwine them. And I know there's a lot, but there's many reasons to do it. But also, you could have just gone right, clean slate, new thing. So what made you decide to intertwine?
Yeah, I think it was I think that it was a natural thing to do, in that Bookbinder does crossover in time and place with the Dictionary of Lost Words, and I was interested in women in the bindery. So I knew I was going to be writing a story about a woman that worked at Oxford University Press, and in the first book there are a lot of scenes and interactions that happen around Oxford University Press. So I immediately thought, I wonder whether the characters in this book are going to bump into the characters in the previous book. And of course, the answer is yes. Gareth works at the press, and he was at the press in 1914 and etc. So I knew that it would be likely, if this was real life, that they would bump into each other or know each other. I also was very interested. I wasn't done with Oxford. I was still really keen to stay there, in a way, to stay in this world. So it was partly selfish. I too loved characters that I didn't spend a lot of time on in Dictionary of Lost Words, and there was an opportunity to explore another facet of a couple of those people, well, Tilda in particular. And so because I knew Tilda would be in the next book, I knew that quite quickly. I actually did seed it in dictionary. So I did sort of, Tilda comes back to Oxford at some point, and she stays with friends who live on a narrowboat on the Oxford Canal. And tiny reference, really, but I knew enough about the new story that I could incorporate that little fact into the previous story. And so there's a link there. But it was also such a joy, I suppose, doing the crossover. I think of them as companions, as in a way I think of them as sisters holding hands, and one enhances the other. You can absolutely read them separately, and you never have to pick up the second book, whichever one you haven't read. And they're complete stories. There's nothing missing from either of them. But if you do read them both, there'll be this heightened understanding of one or two things, which as a writer, I really enjoyed exploring these extra things. And I hope as readers they enjoy coming across characters again.
I wonder if that goes back to your love of those little mystery books when you were a girl, and that there's these little clues and seeds of things.
Oh, wow.
I
have never thought about that, but it might be. It's like I've left a trail, you know. And there is a joy in piecing things together. And I have really enjoyed doing that as a writer. I could imagine myself doing more of it, actually. It's not very common to have. I mean, there's all sorts of genres that have links between books. Detective series do it all the time, but it doesn't happen so much in the kind of fiction that I'm writing. But it has happened. So Sebastian Barry, who I mentioned earlier, he wrote The Secret Scriptures, and he also wrote I can't remember the name of them. A couple of books about the Civil War in America and so on. But every book he writes is actually about the same family, though you wouldn't know it as a reader. But there's these familial links all the way through. Someone is an ancestor of someone from another book. So it's a really tiny thing, but he does this, and I really enjoy how he does it. And that you don't need to know this as a reader, but for him it must bring enormous satisfaction in a way to to have these connections, because you're creating not just
Tessellating
worlds,
it out,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Tessellating it
You're
out.
creating whole family histories, and there's something quite satisfying about that. Kate Atkinson has done it too. So her book Life After Life,
Yeah.
which some of you might have read, which I adored. Her next book was A God in Ruins, and it's actually about one of the brothers in Life After Life. So there's this, you know, sometimes you fall in love with a character that you know you can't write more about because it's just not their story. It's not their time. But then you can write about them later.
I'm just going to pass the little mic down to my Nana, who's got a question.
Hi, Nana.
Hi, Nana. There you go, Nana.
I loved your pictorial representations of the people in the narrow boats. It was absolutely quite beautiful. I'm just wondering where you got that from. It's just a really, really good part of the whole book. And also the compositor, Gareth, how you pictured him, because I've actually seen them at work. Well, I'm an old woman, so there were still compositors around when I was very young. And a friend of ours became a compositor. And the speed they work at, and the fact they do it back to front, and the fact that they have to spell right, just blew me away, because they don't have university educations. These are just blokes that go and do it.
Well, they have 7-year apprenticeships. So
yeah, they did.
Yeah, so they do have a lot of training. So first of all, the first question about the narrowboats. Every time I've been to Oxford, I actually spent so much time walking along the canals. And if you walk along the canals, you're bound to see many, many narrowboats in the UK. And so that's where I got the idea. I just found them so romantic, really, and intriguing. And the other thing I loved about the narrowboat, which is why for me it was really important to include it in the story, is that I really wanted a place that was like a character all on its own, in a way, a bit like the scriptorium was, a place that I could furnish, and I could give so much detail that a reader would be able to imagine themselves in this small space. And a narrowboat was the perfect thing for that. And in terms of how I kind of got to know as much as possible about narrowboats, I read all about them, but I actually just knocked on people's windows and asked if I could come in.
Excellent. That's excellent.
And people were very generous. And one guy in particular, his name's Maffey, and he was a permanent liveaboard narrowboater. And his narrowboat was incredible, and it was full of bookshelves, and and so there was so much I could imagine just by being in his narrowboat. And he was very generous with his time and let me stay there for ages. And he just told me everything I needed to know about narrowboats, and also the difference between a narrowboat now and a narrowboat 100 years ago. And the main difference is a lack of plumbing. And I'll let you use your imaginations. But otherwise, there's not much difference. The lack of plumbing is really the only difference. And so that was really fabulous. And it was just the opportunities that it gave, for creating a space that was so visually, imagined. I just loved it. And so, so that's that question. And then in terms of Gareth and the compositor, I know about that because I did a lot of reading about Oxford University Press. There are lots of wonderful photographs as well of the compositors doing their job. And when I was at Oxford University Press, they have a small museum, and in that museum, they have the trays of type and all of the equipment that the compositors would use. So I was able to touch it all and hold all the tools that they use and get a sense of what it was like.
Wow.
So, and the film that I was telling you about was also useful. You can actually see that film online. Sometimes I don't think it's supposed to be on YouTube, but it often is. So if you just look up the making of a book at Oxford University Press, it should take you to a link to that film, and it's just fabulous to watch.
Do you have a pen, Annie Jane? Can I have it? Because I'll write that down. And I'm going to write down Sebastian Barry. And who else did you suggest? You said
Kate Atkinson.
Kate Atkinson.
And Geraldine Brooks.
Simon Winchester, Geraldine Brooks. Right. I like to get like reading, you know, recommendations from the authors that we chat to. That's great. Good. Jane's writing it down. Geraldine Brooks, Kate Atkinson, and Sebastian Barry. Excellent. So, this is a fun one. In her 1994 book, Bird by Bird, Instructions on Writing and Life, Anne Lamott states, becoming a writer is about becoming conscious. When you're conscious and writing from a place of insight and simplicity and a real caring about the truth, you have the ability to throw the lights on for the reader. I loved that statement, and reading the Bookbinder of Jericho and having read the dictionary, I really felt that you're able to throw the lights on and welcome us into times past and situations and things that we wouldn't otherwise necessarily get to see. I wonder, as a writer of historical fiction, how do you feel about that kind of comment? Do you feel like it's something like that?
Absolutely. And I love that book, by the way. So
Bird by Bird, it's great, isn't it?
Yeah, Bird by Bird. It's excellent. Yeah, excellent for any kind of budding writers in the room. It's a great one to read.
Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly how I feel. So, you know, both of these books started because I was curious and I had questions that I couldn't answer in any other way other than to explore them through fiction. So in the first book, it was, do words mean different things to men and women? And if they do, does it matter that the dictionary was made by men from using words that had been written by men? And in this book, it was who gets to make knowledge, who gets to access it, and what happens when knowledge is denied. And it's, you know, that's quite a broad question. It includes the idea of censorship, but it also includes the idea of you know, who's allowed in to university and who isn't, who gets to you know, who gets to be educated. And these are questions that I couldn't necessarily answer just by, you know, the way I used to do it as a social scientist. And fiction is just such a wonderful way to shine a light into the shadows that exist in the historical record. But also I have come to realize the shadows that exist within archives. So historians and novelists are similar in that we go to the archives to help us fashion our ideas, if you like. We go to the archives to help us understand history. But if the archives are also male projects, and they are, you know, archives by their very nature have been set up by men in order to preserve the things that men in particular find valuable at any time in history. And I had a really good experience of that because if I wanted to write about the men who had worked at Oxford University Press, I would have had no trouble filling in a story because there was so much information about the men and the jobs that they did. But there was almost nothing about the women, even though there were nearly 100 women working at Oxford University Press. There's practically nothing about what they did and nothing about their personal reflections. There's so many personal reflections from the men who worked there at that time, but none from the women. And it's because what they did was not considered valuable. And so archives are full of gaps, just like the history books are full of gaps. And the only way really to fill in those gaps or shine a light, you know, into these shadows is to imagine your way in. And I think fiction, one of the wonderful things about fiction is actually fiction does tell truth. Even though you're fabricating a story, what you're not fabricating is this thing I was talking about before. What you can't fabricate because no one would believe it is human emotion and human responses and reactions to things. The only way a reader will engage with a story is if they believe the human response to something.
Yeah.
And believe it because they know it's true. If they don't believe the human response, then the book will fail to engage the reader. And that's why I think historical fiction and speculative fiction are so similar, because in both cases, while the world might be different to what we know, the thing that stays the same is the human responses to things that happen to them. And that's what we engage with.
Yeah, yeah. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah? I knew you'd have one, Venetia. All right, I'm going to bring the mic over to Venetia. There you go.
Hello, thank you. I just wanted to speak about or ask you about Gwen, and I was interested in when you discussed the women's suffragette movement, and then a bit relating to censorship, how I believe Sylvia Pankhurst did a deal with the British government to not make a fuss during the war.
Yeah,
very interested in what you researched on that.
So it was really interesting. A lot of this research I did for the Dictionary of Lost Words. So I already had an understanding of the women's suffrage movement at that time in the UK. And one of, a few things that I didn't know before I started writing these books was that, just like with any movement, really, there were factions. There were different groups of people approaching the same goal slightly differently. And the suffragettes under the, with the Pankhursts, they were called the suffragettes. They were only called the suffragettes in 1906. In fact, the word suffragette is really interesting because it was first used by newspaper men as an insult to the women who were part of the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, which was headed by Emmeline Pankhurst. This word suffragette was used to put them down, to belittle them, because if you add "et" to the end of a word, it essentially diminishes it. So cigarette, kitchenette, serviette, they're all just smaller, less valuable versions of the original. And so that's where that word comes from. But Emmeline Pankhurst did a really clever thing. A few years later, I think it was around 1913, she took that word and made it the title of their journal. She called it The Suffragette. And suddenly that word's meaning changed because suddenly it became an umbrella for all of these women who agreed with her particular approach to getting the vote. What happened though is there was a difference between how women wanted to fight this fight, and not all women, not all suffragists agreed with what the WSPU were doing, which was essentially creating civil unrest and breaking the law. It's the suffragettes who, on the whole, were arrested and put in prison. It's the suffragettes who would then go on hunger strike. It's the suffragettes who were force-fed. It's also the suffragettes who decided that they would support the war completely, whereas many of the suffragist organisations were against the war. And the WSPU did have an agreement with the government that they would step back on their particular activism as long as the government released all of the women from prison. And one of the things that they agreed to do was to essentially implement the White Feather campaign, which was a government politician's idea, but he had the suffragettes be his foot soldiers in that particular campaign, which was a campaign to humiliate young men into signing up by pinning a white feather to their lapel. And so that's the history of that. And not all suffragists obviously agreed with that. And so many organisations didn't agree with that. Many suffragist organisations were anti-war the entire time. But some were pro-war. So, they all have different approaches to these things.
You covered a really good spectrum of perspective of this war effort, like in this book. I found that fascinating, you seeing we're getting hints of people who, even like when they were deciding that they should potentially stop publishing German poetry because it was, they weren't sure how that was going to be received, and was that going to be a downturn trend in sales, and was it going to, insult the masses, and like there were lots and lots of different things. You did talk about the white feather. I don't know. It was really interesting. You captured the whole time I was reading this book, I felt like I was getting lots and lots of different perspectives of how this was unfolding for everybody, not just the protagonist's view, but a multi-dimensional kind of.
Yeah, I'm glad it comes across that way, because for me, like I said, I start these books with a question, and really by the end of it, I don't necessarily have an answer, but I have a broader sense of what might be important in terms of those questions. So it is important for me to come at the writing from various angles. I don't want to necessarily present a single perspective, because that wouldn't be realistic, because in these times there was no, in any time there's no single perspective, and so I really enjoy, in a way, trying to understand the various perspectives, particularly when they have the same outcome goal in a way. I found the whole suffrage complexities really interesting, but also in this book in particular, it's about class. Class is a really important part of this book, because Peggy is a working class woman. And sorry, the person who asked the question before mentioned Gwen. I just adored writing Gwen. Gwen is essentially at the opposite end of the social scale. She's incredibly privileged, and she's not at all ashamed of her privilege. I love Gwen because she's incredibly privileged, but she's not a snob. And so she, she's very happy to become friends with Peggy, but she's also unaware really of Peggy's life, and but also unapologetic for her own privilege, and the fact that doors are opened for her, quite literally and figuratively. But I really enjoyed understanding, I suppose, the class differences and tensions through those two characters and how they interacted.
Yeah. And I think, without giving away anything for those who haven't read the book yet, but the arc of Gwen is really quite interesting too. I liked how you worked with her character.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions? Yeah, let me bring this over to you. Okay, go.
Thanks. So I'm quite interested in your process of writing and how much you had kind of pre-planned and how much you allowed to unfold.
Oh, yeah.
You talk about
question.
Having fixed on the narrowboat and various characters, but then these characters are also unfolding and you're exploring them as they go. So how that interacts with each other.
Yeah, I do a bit of both. So I am a planner. I'm actually a planner by trade. And I'm a planner by, nature, I think. So the first scene I write is usually a scene right near the beginning of the novel. And the second scene I write is the end. So in both novels, that's what happened. I knew the end almost, very soon after I knew the general context and who my main character was going to be. And then I have a fairly good idea of the main plot points, if you like, or the main life change, moments in my character's life. But whenever I sit down to write a scene, anything can happen. And that's the biggest joy I have as a writer, is as I'm writing, and this is, again, if there's any writers in the audience, this is how it works for me, and I think it's why I never have writer's block. I don't care if what I'm writing is rubbish, because the most interesting things I ever write, they come after a whole lot of rubbish. It's just the act of writing creates the circumstances for insight. And that's what happens in scenes. I'll start writing a scene and it will be pretty pedestrian when I get started. And then as I'm writing, something wonderful happens, or something terrible happens, or something, you know, really moving happens, or whatever. But it wouldn't have happened unless I'd written all of the pedestrian stuff before it. And it's that one little thing that then can send the story into, on not necessarily on a very different trajectory, because the trajectory in both cases has pretty much stayed the same, but it's the thing that gives meaning and depth to either a character, or it might change some aspects of what happens in a character's story. And so it's a little bit of both, a bit of planning and a bit of freewheeling. Yeah.
Mm. So did anything surprise you then with any, because, you know, like any of the characters at all as you were developing them?
I suppose the biggest surprise isn't quite the word, but the most satisfying character to write was Maud.
Yeah.
And that's because Maud is unconventional. Maud sees the world differently, and she's seen as different by the world. And I really, you know, because she's unconventional, because she speaks differently, she communicates differently, I had to, you know, really think about what she said and how she said it and when she said it and what I wanted her words to mean and how I could get a reader to understand her, because she never composes an original sentence. She only echoes what she has heard. And so that was a challenge which I really enjoyed. But the other challenge was making sure that she wasn't in the story as a trope, as a vulnerable person. You know, I mean, there are 1,000 stories with vulnerable people in them, and we know what happens to the vulnerable person. And I didn't want that to be Maud's story. I wanted it to be more complex than that. Because life is more complex than that. So she is my most satisfying character. I really loved writing her.
Yeah, we're just having people say you did it beautifully. Yeah, you really did Maud beautifully.
Thank you.
So we're getting close to the end of our time together, Pip, but I just wanted to mention some really fun stuff for you. So I read today that the Dictionary of Lost Words is potentially under development for a TV series and becoming a stage show. Is that right?
Yes, so it premieres in September.
Big round of applause.
Yeah,
Big round of applause.
And it's going to the Opera House in
Oh,
October. So
that's awesome.
They've already got the cast and everything. Wow. So it's well underway. Yeah.
So what kind of involvement do you have with these sorts of projects?
So with the stage production, Mitchell Boutel, who is the creative director at the State Theatre Company of South Australia, he rang, we went for coffee. He asked, could they turn it into a stage production? I said yes. Then he said, would you like to write it? But I could tell on his face.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, no. I quickly said no, because it's a completely different.
And then he gave you a coffee. So you said the right thing, and then he gave you a coffee.
Yeah, but I'm not a playwright. I would love to try my hand at writing a play, but not with my book. And so Verity Lawton is the playwright, and we have had a few discussions. I've seen the draft and commented on it, but it's completely her work.
Yeah.
And I'm thrilled with what she's done with it.
Yeah.
And with the limited series, so it's been optioned for a limited series, I will be an executive producer on that. So I will have more input on that. But with all of these things, I think I love the idea of someone taking a piece of art I've made and then applying their own craft and skill and insight to it and making it something different. I'd be disappointed in a way if it was a carbon copy of what I'd done, because theatre and screen has so much potential that the page doesn't. Just like the page has a whole lot of potential that theatre and screen doesn't, like, you know, internal kind of dialogue. And so I'm really looking forward to both of these projects being something a little different, but having the same DNA, so that the people who've loved the books will see the things that they've loved in these new productions.
Yeah, in these translations through different mediums. It's beautiful.
That's right. They're translations. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh. So what is next for you, Pip? Are you writing anything at the moment?
Not much. I'm thinking a lot. I do have some ideas. In fact, the thing I was writing before I wrote the dictionary is still an idea, a story that I'd quite like to pursue.
The contemporary piece.
So it'll be quite different, but I would quite like to continue with that. And I do also have another idea for a novel set in Oxford, but I'm going to let that one percolate for a little while. And see where that goes. But I have no shortage of ideas.
No final question? Oh yeah, one more. Thank you.
Will we see Peggy and Gwen in the percolating novel?
Oh,
I'm not sure. I can't guarantee anything, but I think there will be some crossover characters of one kind or another. Yeah. I love doing that.
Any guesses what auxiliary characters could turn up in the third one? Or suggestions.
I'll jot it down.
Here's Nana again. Here we go, Nan.
I was fascinated by the business of I can't think of the word now. When they banned stuff. Censorship, because they've now censored this book on sex.
I know.
And it's the bestseller online now.
Yes.
So I love that. I love that bit. But also, I needed a comment. After having read the words one,
Dictionary of words.
I bawled my eyes out in the last two chapters. I've read it 3 times and I've bawled my eyes out each time.
That's good. You know, you want to feel something.
I feel like crying thinking about it. Thank you for it. I love it.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for spending time with it.
All right. Anyone else? No? All good? All right. Well, Pip, this has been a wonderful hour. Thank you so much for joining us. We've learned so much. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing your creative process. It's been wonderful. And best of luck for everything. And hopefully, so you're still promoting the Bookbinder of Jericho at the moment. And have you got some time at home now, or are you back on the road?
I've got a couple of weeks, and then I go to the Byron Bay Writers Festival.
Oh,
so that
very
will be
cool.
lovely. Yeah, a bit warmer than where I am at the moment. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we really look forward to whatever comes next.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's just a delight. Yeah, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. And feel free to graciously sign yourself out, because we're a bit slow with the tech here. So have a great evening. Thank you.
It was lovely to meet you, and lovely to be there with you tonight. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you.